Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're talking about a force so powerful, it's literally redrawing the map of our world. It's breaking coastlines and forcing us to question our very idea of what's permanent.
You know, when we look at a map, say of the United States, we see these neat, clean lines. Geographers call them formal regions. Each state has its own clear, fixed boundary. We just trust these lines, right? They give us a sense of order, they tell us where Texas ends and Oklahoma begins. We assume they're set in stone.
But here's the unsettling question. What if they're not? What happens when the geography we've built our entire world on isn't permanent? What happens when the very edges of the map just start to wash away?
So why are our maps in flux? Well, to understand that, we need to look at this powerful, unseen force that's acting like a planetary cartographer, and it all starts with our planet's rising fever.
Okay, so here's the basic science. The natural greenhouse effect. That's what keeps our planet warm and cozy enough for life. But what we're seeing now is an intensified version. Human activities are pumping out more greenhouse gases, and they act like a thicker blanket around the Earth, trapping way more heat. To put it simply, our planet is running a fever.
And this global fever does two major things to our oceans. First, when water gets warmer, it physically expands. It takes up more space. That's called thermal expansion. And second, you've got these massive ice sheets and glaciers on land that are melting. And all that water has to go somewhere. It flows right into the sea. These two things together are the engine driving global sea level rise.
And let's be absolutely clear, this isn't some problem for our grandkids to solve in the distant future. This new, rising waterline is actively re-engineering the planet's coastlines right now, erasing the edges we always thought were permanent.
You know, we've always known that some boundaries are a bit shifty. Take the Rio Grande, for example. It forms a huge part of the US-Mexico border, but it's a river. It naturally changes its course over time, sometimes slowly, and sometimes after a big flood, all at once.
Okay, now take that idea of a shifting, unpredictable river and just blow it up to a planetary scale. Imagine that same instability applied to every single coastline on Earth. Every beach, every port, every coastal city now has to deal with that same uncertainty. The line we draw between land and sea, it's just not a given anymore.
But for some nations, this is way more serious than just losing a bit of coastline. For them, it's about facing the very real possibility of complete geographic extinction.
Think about it. What even is a country? At its most fundamental level, the unit of our political world is the state. And by definition, a state is tied to its territory, the physical land inside its borders. That land is its foundation. So this forces us to confront a mind-bending question that strikes right at the heart of international law and our idea of a nation. If a country's land is completely swallowed by the ocean, does it just cease to exist? Can you have a government, a people, a culture, without a physical place on the map? Now, of course, this threat isn't spread out evenly. The bullseye is really on a few specific kinds of places. We're talking about low-lying coastal areas, incredibly crowded regions where millions of people live just a few feet above sea level, and, crucially, the great river deltas, those fertile cradles where so much of civilization began.
And for those deltas, it's a devastating 1-2 punch. It's a true double threat. Not only is the sea level rising up to meet them, but in many cases, the land itself is actually sinking, a process called subsidence. They're literally being squeezed from above and below.
So, you see, this isn't just a story about land and water. All of these physical changes to our planet, they're setting the stage for a human story, one of the largest, most disruptive human migrations in history.
The potential scale here is just staggering. We're not talking about thousands of people or even a few million. Projections suggest that upwards of 200 million people could be displaced from their homes by rising seas in this century alone. That's not a migration, it's a massive planetary dispersal of people.
There's this provocative quote that says, "We are all climate refugees now." And what that really gets at is that the old idea of this being somebody else's problem, happening over there, is completely gone. Whether it's through direct displacement or through the economic and political instability that follows, the consequences are becoming a universal human experience.
So this is the new reality we're facing. A powerful geographical force is at work, actively erasing islands and flooding the very river deltas where civilization was born. And as that land disappears, it leaves us with these huge, urgent questions. What happens to the people? What happens to their cultures, their rights, and what happens to borders?
That's the challenge our changing map presents to us all.
All right, so last time we saw how forces like melting ice and rising seas are literally redrawing the maps of our world. But those aren't just lines on paper, not at all. They represent some really profound and often volatile human consequences. Today, we're going to dive right into the flashpoints that erupt when the ground literally shifts beneath our feet. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the human cost and look at a whole new kind of refugee. Then, we'll get into the flashpoints over resources. And we'll wrap up by tackling a really mind-bending question. What happens when a nation itself is on the verge of just disappearing from the map entirely? So let's start with this rapidly growing group of displaced people. Now, these folks aren't fleeing bombs or political persecution like we usually think of. No, they're fleeing the environment itself.
And that brings us to this key term, climate refugee. It's a huge deal. It describes millions of people whose homes are becoming uninhabitable, not because of an invading army, but because our planet is changing. This is a fundamental, massive shift in the whole story of human migration.
And this really lays out the difference perfectly. We all understand the tragic reality of a war refugee, someone fleeing violence. A climate refugee, though, is fleeing a totally different kind of collapse. The collapse of an ecosystem, the loss of land you can farm, the slow-motion erasure of a coastline. We're moving from a story of conflicts between people to a new story, a conflict between people and their own environment.
And I want to be super clear. This is not some distant future problem. It is happening right now. In coastal Bangladesh, rising seas are pushing saltwater miles inland, completely poisoning the rice paddies people depend on. And across the African Sahel, right on the southern edge of the Sahara, the desert is expanding, just swallowing up villages and forcing whole communities to pack up and leave. This crisis is already here. And that issue in Bangladesh, the saltwater, builds right into one of the most immediate threats we face, the slow, creeping loss of our most essential resource, freshwater.
This question gets right to the heart of the matter. See, a rising ocean isn't just about flooded beaches and coastlines. It creates a hidden battleground right under our feet, where saltwater is waging this silent war against our freshwater supplies.
So what's really fascinating here is how this invisible invasion works. As the sea level comes up, the denser, heavier saltwater basically wedges itself underneath the lighter freshwater that's stored in these underground aquifers. It's a slow-motion disaster that contaminates wells, poisons the soil, and just chokes agriculture from the roots up.
And this isn't happening in some remote, far-off place. This is directly threatening the breadbaskets and major population centers of entire regions. I'm talking about the great river deltas, the Mekong in Southeast Asia, the Nile in Egypt, places that are home to tens of millions of people. They are on the front lines, watching their land and their water turn to poison.
Well, this growing scarcity of usable water naturally leads us to our next big topic, the rise of modern geopolitical conflicts. But these aren't about oil or territory in the old-school sense. They're about the control of life-giving rivers.
This timeline shows you the chain of events, and it's pretty alarming. For centuries, you had these massive glaciers, like in the Himalayas, that acted as these really stable, predictable water towers for all of Asia's great rivers. But now, those glaciers are melting way faster, and rainfall's all over the place. That predictable flow, it's gone. Suddenly, a shared resource becomes a strategic asset, and working together, well, that gives way to fighting over it.
And if you want a perfect modern example of this, look no further than the high-stakes showdown happening right now on Africa's longest river. The entire conflict boils down to one massive piece of infrastructure.
Okay, so here you can see just how tough this conflict is. Ethiopia, which is upstream at the river's source, sees this dam as its ticket to power its economy and lift millions out of poverty. But then you have Egypt, downstream, which has relied on the Nile for its entire 5,000-year history. For them, any cut to that water flow is a direct, existential threat.
And this chart just boils the whole thing down to two incredibly powerful opposing forces. For one country, it's all about the fundamental drive for development and a better future. For the other, it's about the fundamental fear of survival, and the river, it's caught right in the middle of this tug-of-war. So, from conflicts over resources, we're now going to zoom way out to the most existential threat of all. A question that honestly sounds like it's straight out of science fiction, but it's becoming terrifyingly real. What happens when a country just ceases to physically exist?
This is a challenge our entire system of international law was never, ever designed to handle. We're talking about sovereign states, members of the United Nations, like the Pacific island nation of Kiribati, that are facing complete physical disappearance under the waves. They're on the brink of becoming what you might call ex-nations.
And this is no longer some philosophical question for a university class. This is an urgent, real-world dilemma. When the land itself is gone, what is left of the nation? What happens to its culture, its history, its identity? All of that is tied to a place that literally no longer exists.
So the crucial point here is that this creates this massive hole in international law. I mean, just think about these questions for a second. Does a government in exile still have sovereignty over territory that's now the seabed? Can it keep its seat and its vote at the UN? And what about its huge oceanic territory, an area rich in resources? And maybe the most pressing question of all, who is responsible for its entire population, a population of refugees with no country to ever return to?
So, as we've seen, the physical changes happening to our planet are directly creating new human crises at every single level. From a single family forced to flee their home, to nations fighting over rivers, to the very definition of what a country even is.
And this all leads us to a final, really critical thought. Is our future just destined to be one of conflict and retreat? Or can humanity, the same species that reshapes the planet, use geography and engineering to actually build our way out of this crisis? We'll dig into that next time.
You know, if you look at a map of global power today, it's pretty clear that all the lines of force, we're talking economic, political, military, they're all converging on one massive region, the Indo-Pacific. This is the new center of gravity. It's the arena where the future of the 21st century is really being written.
So that really brings us to the big question we're going to dig into. Forget the old power centers, in Europe or across the Atlantic. The real contest, the one that is going to define the next global order, is happening right here. And the stakes, they could not be higher. And just look at the sheer scale of it. We're talking about a theater that stretches all the way from the Indian Ocean to the shores of the Americas. It covers these incredibly diverse and culturally rich regions of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. It's right here, across thousands of islands and these absolutely vital sea lanes, that a new great game is being played.
Okay, so let's get into the heart of it. What's driving all this? Well, at its core, it's a classic story just on a global scale. It's a clash of titans, and each one has a profoundly different vision for how this critical region, and really the whole world, should work.
And you've probably already guessed the two main players here. The central dynamic, the engine that's driving almost everything in the Indo-Pacific, is this escalating competition between the established global power, the United States, and the rising power, China. Their rivalry is changing everything.
Now, this is where you can see their game plans side by side, and they could not be more different. The U.S. strategy is all about maintaining the system that's already in place, what it calls the rules-based international order. And it does that by strengthening its military alliances like AUKUS with the UK and Australia, and the Quad, which brings in Australia, India, and Japan. China, on the other hand, is basically trying to build a new system with itself at the center. Its main tool? Economic gravity, using its massive Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative to pull other nations into its orbit. And this really breaks down the different flavors of power that are at play. You've got the U.S. relying on classic hard power, military strength, alliances. China is flexing its own rising hard power, mostly through these huge economic and infrastructure projects. But notice that third column, the European Union. It's bringing something totally different to the table, normative power. The power of rules, regulations, and standards. So you have three major actors, each with a totally distinct playbook. Okay, but here's the thing. It is so easy to only look at this from 30,000 feet, from Washington or Beijing or Brussels. And that's a huge mistake. We need to shift our perspective to the nations that are at the geographic heart of this whole contest. Because believe me, they are not just pawns on some geopolitical chessboard. They have their own goals, their own plans. And this is the one question that the great powers always seem to forget to ask. While they're busy worrying about strategic competition and military bases, what are the actual real-world priorities for the people who call the Pacific home? And when you look at their priorities, you see this huge disconnect. For Pacific Island nations, the number one threat isn't some foreign navy, it's rising sea levels. Their main concerns are literally existential. Climate change, economic survival, just protecting their sovereignty and trying to stop the illegal fishing that's wiping out their most vital resource. Their reality is just worlds away from the geopolitical headlines. So what do you do when you're caught between giants? Well, you get smart. You learn to play them off of one another. It's this really clever and sophisticated diplomatic balancing act. They're using the rivalry to get aid for climate resilience, to attract investment for their economies, and to get security partnerships to protect their fisheries, all while being incredibly careful not to become too dependent on any one country. And this is where things get really interesting. This is where a third major player sees a real opening. Could the European Union actually offer a different kind of partnership? A third way for all those nations that don't want to be forced to pick a side between the US and China? To really get what the EU is doing, you have to understand this concept, normative power. It's not about tanks and ships. It's about shaping the rules of the game. It's the ability to influence what's considered normal on the world stage. And you do it through diplomacy, trade policy, and promoting certain values. It's influence by attraction, not by force. So what does that actually look like in the real world? It's not just one thing. It's this whole comprehensive package. Take its Global Gateway Initiative. It's designed to compete directly with China's Belt and Road, but by offering a more sustainable and, frankly, values-based approach to building infrastructure. It's all about building these deep, broad partnerships in connectivity, green energy, and good governance, instead of just transactional deals. So the whole play here is for the EU to position itself as something different, an alternative. For a Pacific Island nation that's worried about getting crushed between two giants, the EU can come in and say, hey, we're a neutral partner, we're a mediator who's more interested in building coalitions to solve shared problems like climate change than we are in fueling some big geopolitical competition. All right, so let's pull all these threads together and see what this all means for the future. Because nothing here is set in stone. The future of the Indo-Pacific, and honestly the future of the world, is being negotiated right now in this incredibly complex and dynamic way. You see, the era of a single superpower or even two superpowers just calling all the shots, that's probably over. We're heading into what experts call a multipolar world order, and all that means is that power is spread out among several major players, or poles, and each one has its own interests and its own strengths. And you can kind of see that shift right here. Yeah, you've still got the United States with its dominant military, and you've got China as this rapidly rising economic and military force. But they are not the only players in the game anymore. You have these other crucial poles of influence, like the European Union, India, Japan. They're all making the distribution of global power more spread out, and frankly, more complex. This is not a two-player game. So what's the bottom line here? It's that there is no simple bottom line. The future isn't just going to be an American-led world or a Chinese-led world. It's going to be this messy, dynamic balance. You'll have fierce competition in some areas, but you'll also have necessary cooperation on big issues like climate. And underneath it all is this growing desire by every nation, big and small, for strategic autonomy, the freedom to choose their own path. And that leaves us with the critical, maybe billion-dollar question for this new era. As we move away from a world with really clear lines of power, will this new multipolar system be more stable, with all these checks and balances preventing any one power from running away with it? Or will it be more chaotic, with more players leading to more friction and more conflict? The answer to that question is being decided right now in the waters of the Indo-Pacific.
And that is a wrap on our Geography and Geopolitics Week. Wow, what an incredible journey. First off, from all of us, a huge thank you for coming along for the ride.
Let's do a quick look back at just how much ground we actually covered together.
We started right at the beginning, with how ancient rivers basically birthed our first cities.
Then we climbed mountains and saw how they could be both walls and strategic doors.
After that, we hit the high seas to understand the invisible power of the great trade winds.
We saw how tiny little choke points like the Suez Canal have massive economic power.
And how a single river can slice a city in two, creating totally different cultures.
Our trip then took us to islands, exploring that unique strategic power they have.
We wrapped up by seeing how climate change is literally redrawing the map right now.
You know, if there's one big idea to take away from all this, it's this. Geography is destiny.
These landforms and waterways, they're like the invisible rules that shaped everything about us. We had so much fun putting this together, and we really hope you enjoyed watching.
But that chapter is closed. So, the big question is, what's next?
Well, tomorrow, a brand new week-long series kicks off with a whole new topic.
So make sure you subscribe and turn on those notifications. You're not going to want to miss it.
And hey, one last thing. This is a community, which means we need your help. We want you to help us choose which rabbit hole we're going to go down next.
Just pop over to the Community tab on our channel page and vote in the new poll. It's live all weekend. You get to help us pick a future theme for the show.
Thanks again for such a great week. We honestly can't wait to see you all tomorrow.